Hello and welcome to this presentation of the Jackson-Madison County Instructional Framework. This framework is designed to bring about simplicity, clarity, and focus to the work that we are doing in our classrooms. I hope that you find this presentation to be beneficial and informative to the work that we are endeavoring to do in each and every classroom in the Jackson-Madison County school system. Our plan moving forward. We will successfully advance our priorities and meet our goals as a district if we rely on research-based plans for instructional improvement in every single classroom. We must stick to this plan throughout the course of time to ensure that we're giving our students every opportunity to be successful. This plan moving forward will focus on three aspects: what we teach, which is the quality of the curriculum that we use; how we teach this curriculum, which is the structure of our lessons; and a focus on authentic literacy. What are we doing in every single classroom? Reading, writing, and discussing are revolved around a text with a literacy-based focus. If we focus on these three aspects as a district consistently and get them right, we will ensure that we are providing high-quality instruction for every single student in our school system. What we teach. Marzano says that curriculum may be the single largest factor that determines how many students in a school will learn. So, at the fall of this school year, we began a renewed emphasis on the curriculum, what we teach. As you know, we have started Eureka Math, and this will go K through 12. Eureka Math has been proven to be a high-quality curriculum. Now we shift our focus to our ELA, as we have solidified the work we're doing in our K2 and have pilots of quality materials in 3 through 12. In other content areas, we will now begin to focus on incorporating text in every single lesson, every single day, across all content areas. We must decrease the variability of the quality of materials from room to room and school to school. We started this practice with using the use of the IPG, our Instructional Practice Guide. This tool is focused on ensuring fidelity of the implementation of high-quality instructional materials across the system. How we teach. Effective teaching is not some complex combination of talent, technique, or long experience. Anyone can immediately implement the most essential common elements of good teaching with success and get better at them with practice. We want to ensure that we are practicing the right things instructionally. And not only that we are practicing the right thing, that we have a common understanding of what the expectations are and how we deliver this high-quality curriculum. We want to identify research-based, time-proven aspects of effective instruction. And not only do we want to identify those, we want to be able to give high-quality feedback peer-to-peer across the district in order to improve our work. We must not only decrease the variability of effective instruction from room to room and school to school, but going back to how we teach or what we teach, we want to decrease the variability of the curriculum we use as well. So this is all about bringing alignment to the work that we are doing in our schools. And this directly aligns with our curriculum work and complements the IPG indicators. And lastly, authentic literacy. As we know, literacy is a huge focus in our district. The clearest differentiator in reading between students who are college ready and students who are not is the ability to comprehend complex texts. And the only way our students will become better at comprehending those complex texts is if they are exposed to this on a daily basis. Authentic literacy consists of purposeful reading, writing, and discussion about text in order to build skills and knowledge. We will accomplish this by the text and tasks in the new ELA curriculum, but they also must be integrated in all other aspects of the content except for math in our school district. This framework is designed to help ensure that we are effectively able to support the work that teachers are doing in order to not only focus on what we teach, how we teach, but how we incorporate authentic literacy opportunities into the work that we are doing in every single classroom. Remember that literacy is the spine that holds all of this together. Every single person in our district is a reading teacher. Unless you are a math teacher, your class should include one or multiple texts every single day. Improving literacy is an educational issue, an economic issue, and most importantly, it is a moral issue. So, the Jackson-Madison County Instructional Framework focuses on the how, the what, and we also want to provide examples throughout the rest of this presentation and talk about the feedback that will be given in order for us all to improve instructionally. So again, I hope that you find this presentation to be beneficial and informative on the Jackson-Madison County Instructional Framework.
Hello everyone. During this portion of the presentation, we'll look at the instructional framework and talk about why it's important. This will be a great time to jot down notes and think of any questions that you might have. There will be opportunities to stop and discuss later in the presentation. Last fall, the district began a series of IPG walkthroughs at every school. These were based on standard alignment, Core Action 1, which is the use of complex text, Core Action 2, which is the use of text-based tasks that meet the standards, and Core Action 3, fully engaging students with those tasks. What we found is that a majority of classrooms weren't consistently meeting all indicators. So a majority of rooms weren't consistently using text-based tasks, and engaging all students. We know that the key to student growth is meeting all three of these core actions. So the question becomes, how do we effectively combine what we are teaching, our curriculum, and our resources, with how we are teaching it in a way to fully engage all students with high quality materials? When you look at our instructional framework, you'll see three components that make up the how portion. This is the starter, the engagement, and the ending. Within these components, you'll see certain strategies that are research-based, experience-proven things that you can incorporate on a daily basis to improve the effectiveness of your instruction. The bottom portion of the framework outlines the what. These are the indicators from the IPG that the district began using in the fall of 2017. When you look at the instructional framework as a whole, you'll see the how portion at the top with the starter, engagement, ending, and the what portion on the bottom half with standard alignment and core actions 1, 2, and 3 from the IPG. So now let's dive into the how and look specifically at the starter, engagement, and ending portion of the instructional framework. On this slide, you can see a screenshot of the how components of our instructional framework, the starter, engagement, and ending. In this portion of the presentation, we're going to unpack the starter and what it involves. The starter is composed of three main components: the greeting, a focusing activity, and your objectives and agenda for the class. One quick note on the focusing activity. Each school will have a consistent name for what this is called in their building. So one school might call it a do now, another school might call it a bell ringer. The point is that there's a consistent name for your focusing activity school-wide. What we don't want is students to move from one class to the next and to hear the focusing activity referred to by 3 or 4 different names during the course of a single day. Each principal will lead the process of deciding the name for this at their school. The first aspect of the starter is the greeting. We want to make sure that students feel welcome in our classrooms every single day. Now, this is going to look different in early grades than it does in upper elementary, middle, and high school. Early elementary teachers, we know it's very important that you're in the room to assist students as they come in and to help them get situated and begin work. But by the time we move into upper elementary, middle, and high school, it's definitely okay to stand near the door to greet students as they enter so that you can have a presence inside your classroom and outside in the hallway as students move to class. Why is this important? It helps us to build relationships. It allows us to communicate expectations as students enter the room. And it helps us identify any problems or difficult situations that might exist with individual students on a given day, simply by their demeanor as they enter the room. The focusing activity. Learning must begin when students enter the room. So we will have a focusing activity of some kind posted or ready for students before they enter the room. We've determined a 3 to 5 rule of thumb to help you guide your thinking on this. This simply means that in general, there will be 3 to 5 questions of increasing complexity answered, or 3 to 5 sentences written in response to a prompt. Now, what this doesn't mean is that if you have 2 questions that's automatically wrong, or that if you have 6 questions that's automatically wrong. The 3 to 5 is simply a rule of thumb to help you guide your thinking so that the focusing activity is able to be completed within a reasonable amount of time, 7 to 12 minutes at the beginning of your class. It's important that it's related to a previous or current lesson to trigger student thinking, to get them reflecting on what they've already learned or anticipating what they will learn. It's important that they can begin this work without direction from their teacher. They should be able to have their greeting with you at the door, enter the room, and get started without any further direction or assistance. Now, like I said previously, this part really pertains to upper elementary, middle, and high school. We know that in early elementary, it's important that you stay with your students in the room and that you're circulating, assisting them as they get started with the focusing activity. But in upper grades, upper elementary, middle, and high school, students should be able to begin work without direction from a teacher consistently on a daily basis. And then lastly, it's important to review or discuss the focusing activity. It's an important, meaningful part of your class, and this will help you to make connections with what students have done. It lets them know it's important, and it segues nicely into the rest of your lesson. So why is this important? It helps us to maximize the use of instructional time. We can't teach bell to bell if instruction doesn't start when students enter the room. It communicates a sense of urgency by showing students that you expect them to begin work as soon as they get into your room. It helps create a clear transition between a hallway state and a learning state in the classroom with students. They are anticipating as they walk into the room the learning that's about to begin, and this will have an impact on their behavior as they enter your room. It creates a consistent start and reduces variables in a student's day. They know what's expected of them, and it's expected as they transition from one class to the next. And lastly, it helps with classroom management because you don't have to consistently every day tell them to start work. They get started on their own. So you can increase the positive interactions that you have with them at the door and decrease the non-positive interactions where you're telling them to get started, telling them to quiet down, and asking them to begin work. The third part of the starter section are the objectives and the agenda. So it's important that your current learning objectives and agenda for your class are posted and communicated, and that they're based on the standards being taught. What this doesn't mean is that you need to have every single standard written verbatim for your lesson. That's not what we're talking about. What we are talking about is that you have learning objectives or outcomes identified and communicated to students, and that there is an agenda posted so that students know what you're doing today. And this will help to eliminate one of the most frequent questions that you're often asked. What are we doing today? They can simply look on the board and see. Why is this important? It helps you to define the major chunks or segments of your lesson. It lets students know what they're going to learn. It lets them know they're in a structured environment and that there are expectations for their time in your class on a given day. And it fosters a sense of safety and security by letting the students know that you have a plan and that that plan is going to be carried out. So to recap, there are 3 major components of the starter section: the greeting, the focusing activity, and the objectives and agenda. Now would be a great time to pause the video and have some conversation and clarify any questions that might exist. Okay, moving on to the engagement section. There are also 3 components in the engagement section: chunking, gradual release, and then teacher talk and student work. So when we talk about chunking, all that is meant is that the lesson is broken down into smaller segments so that you're able to assess student understanding, provide feedback, and reteach when necessary. These chunks of your lesson should be aligned to your objectives for the day and should be related to your agenda for the day. So if I teach a 50-minute class, I might have 2 or 3 chunks that exist for that class. If I teach a 90-minute class, I might have 3 or 4 or even 5 chunks for my lesson on a given day. This helps to make sure that each portion of the lesson is manageable and not overly long. And this also helps you formatively assess within each chunk or segment of your lesson so that you can assess progress on the objectives that you have for the class. The next component is gradual release. So when we think about a single chunk of your lesson or a single segment, this would occur within that single chunk or segment of your lesson. And we're all familiar with gradual release in terms of the I do, we do, you do process. But I want to point out a couple of specific things about how we can think about using this. So the I do and we do portions of gradual release help provide us with opportunities to model thinking, to model processes and procedures for our students, and then practice them together as a class. The you do portion allows students to work on a small chunk by themselves or with another student while you formatively assess how well they are able to complete the task in front of them. The last component of the gradual release process is a time when students complete a portion of the work alone in order to display mastery of this particular portion of the lesson. So the first you do component might be a couple of questions that a student does alone or with another student while you're walking around the room, seeing if they're able to do it successfully and with mastery. The final component of gradual release, the you do alone, will be when they complete the rest of the task. So if it's in a math class, this might be where they answer 4 or 5 questions. If it's in an ELA class or science or social studies, it might be where they're reading the rest of a text and answering questions. It's simply there to make sure that we can ensure students master what we're asking them to do. So why is all this important? It lets us model. It allows us to get immediate feedback. It allows us to ensure that students are able to do what we want them to do before we fully release them into a task. It lets us test it out on a small chunk. And lastly, thinking about the notion of a feedback loop. It allows us to, in a repetitive way, spot errors and correct them before moving on. And when we get into this habit of modeling, giving students a small chunk to do and while we check before giving them the rest of the task, we'll be able to better formatively assess our students. The last component of the engagement section refers to teacher talk and student work. And when you think about it, during any portion of any lesson, one of 2 things is always happening. The teacher is talking or students are working. And so we're going to talk about a couple of strategies within each one of those that will allow us to ensure we are fully engaging our students. So when a teacher is talking, the main strategy to use is cold calling when we ask questions. Cold calling simply means that the teacher actively decides which student will answer the question rather than allowing students to raise their hands or voluntarily respond or choral response. Cold calling ensures that all students in the class are actively paying attention, and it communicates to them that it's important for them to pay attention because they could be called on at any time. A couple of important things to use along with cold calling are lifelines and not allowing students to opt out. So if you cold call a student that doesn't know the answer to the question you're asking, then they should be able to select another student to help them, or the teacher can identify another student to help them, so that one student can explain to another student how they understand it. And then the student that was originally asked the question responds back to the teacher, so they're not allowed to opt out. This is just a simple, effective process that you can use to ensure students are listening, to ensure that they get it, and to make sure that all students are responsible for the learning that takes place. Another thing that's important during the time when a teacher might be talking is that students slant. And this acronym simply means to sit up, lean forward, ask and answer questions, note key information, and track the speaker. These components, SLANT acronym, is simply designed to let us know what an actively engaged student looks like. So we would be looking for these things as we look at students in any classroom. Now, when students are working, what should happen there? The main strategy here is something called praise, prompt, and leave. So as you have released students to work on a task, this simply means that you're purposely circulating, praising the good things that you see, the understandings that exist, prompting students when you see something that needs more consideration or something they might have wrong or need to go back and look at again, and then leaving and allowing them to do it because you're going to come back and check on them again. Thinking about the structure of your classroom, can you reach every student in 8 steps? Now, this doesn't mean that if it takes 9 steps that your room needs to be totally reorganized. This is just something for you to test out in your own room to ensure that you're able to reach all students in a reasonable amount of time, because purposefully circulating is a very important component of any lesson. Another thing to think about is working in pairs versus working in small groups. We definitely want to give preference to working in pairs because it's much easier to ensure that students are engaged when they're working with one other student than when they're working with 3 or 4 or 5 other students. You as the teacher can walk around your room and look around your room and see if pairs of students are on task and working together. But when you're observing 4 or 5 students that are working, it's often very hard to tell who's doing the work and who's not. So we want to give preference to working in pairs over working in small groups. And then lastly, something that's very familiar, the think, pair, share strategy. We want to add one component to that. Before we allow students to pair up and share their thoughts, we just want to ask them to jot down some notes. And when you think about it, this really makes sense. As they think, they're jotting down a couple of notes, then they pair with another student and share their thoughts. One non-negotiable at the root of all this is that sitting at the desk is simply something that doesn't have a place in our lessons. And so no teacher sad or sitting at desk should occur. Why are these things important? There's a purpose to all parts of the lesson, and when we ask questions and check on those things, we underscore that. We make that known. The brain that does the work does the learning. We want to swing the pendulum as far as possible to having students engage with questions, with tasks, with text as often as possible, and avoid long portions of a lesson when the teacher is doing a majority of the talking and students are not able to engage with the work itself. We know that as instruction improves, behavior will improve. And one key component of improving instruction is improving engagement with the tasks of the lesson. Lastly, when a vacuum exists, when nothing is happening, we know negative things will occur. So we want to avoid the void in our classrooms and make sure that there are meaningful opportunities to engage at all times. So to recap, the three main components of engagement are chunking, gradual release, and teacher talk and student work. Now would be a great time to pause the video, discuss, and clarify any questions that might have come up during this portion of the presentation. The final portion of the how component of our instructional framework is the ending. And the ending is composed of two main components, the closing assessment and a timekeeping strategy. The closing assessment allows us to bring closure to the lesson through the form of a formative assessment. Now, you will check for understanding and formatively assess all through your class, but it's important to have a final closing assessment for a few reasons. Number one, it informs us on what we should teach tomorrow. What is the new information that needs to be taught tomorrow based on what they learned today? Secondly, what do I need to reteach from today in the form of review because they just didn't get it. We need to go back over it. And the third question is, which students need remediation or enrichment? And your closing assessment, that final formative assessment of your class, should help you to answer these three questions. Now, just like we had the 3 to 5 rule of thumb for the focusing activity, the same exists for the closing assessment. So we would be looking for 3 to 5 questions to be answered, or 3 to 5 sentences written to determine if students mastered the objectives you communicated at the beginning of the lesson. Why is this important? It gives you feedback. It lets you know what you need to do, what you need to teach or reteach. It lets you assess the progress that was made on the objectives you set at the beginning of your lesson. Your closing assessment should be tied to the objectives you communicated at the beginning of the lesson and the objectives that you actually covered during the lesson. Research shows us that simply by circling back and drawing students' attention to the key components, the main things that we wanted them to learn during the course of a lesson, that we can improve their long-term memory and the retention of the material by up to 50%. The closing assessment allows us to reinforce those key ideas, let them reflect and draw conclusions on the day. It gives us opportunities to incorporate higher order thinking questions. And lastly, it's a great opportunity to transition smoothly from one lesson to the next, because your closing assessment questions from today could very easily become part of your focusing activity for tomorrow. And so when we step back, you can really see the cyclical process that exists from one lesson to the next. The second thing to consider in the ending section of our framework is a timekeeping strategy. It's very important that you have a consistent way of making sure that there's time at the end of your lesson to do your final closing assessment. So this could be something as simple as a timer that you start at the beginning of class that goes off and notifies you when there's a few minutes left. It could be a student whose job it is to remind you when there's 12 to 15 minutes left in class, so that you can plan and think on your feet and make sure that you're able to do the closing assessment that makes sense for your lesson on any given day. Why is this important? It's one less thing to think about. If you know that a timer is going to notify you when it's time to start your closing assessment, or that a responsible student is going to let you know when it's time, and that's one less thing for you to have on your mind throughout the course of the lesson. It just ensures that you have time for that final closing assessment so you can ensure mastery is assessed. Take this opportunity to stop the video, discuss, and clarify any questions that might exist about the ending portion of the instructional framework. At this point, we've reviewed the starter, engagement, and ending components to the instructional framework. As was stated earlier, these three components make up the how for our instructional framework. So now let's talk about how we combine the what with the how portion that we just reviewed. The components of starter, engagement, and ending, or C, work together with the IPG core actions to complete our framework. This is the how and the what. Moving forward, these two together will be our instructional framework. During this portion of the presentation, we'll look at how feedback is identified using the instructional framework and how that feedback will be incorporated into coaching conversations. If a walkthrough happens at the beginning of your class, the starter box would be the focus, along with the three core actions of the IPG. During the starter section, the focusing activity will be the primary thing that is looked at in light of the core actions and indicators from the IPG. If a walkthrough happens in the middle of your class, the engagement box will be the focus, along with the three core actions of the IPG. During the engagement portion, all of the questions and tasks and any assignments that you might give would be the things that are looked at alongside the core actions and indicators from the IPG. If a walkthrough happens at the end of your class, the ending would be the focus, along with the three core actions from the IPG. Your closing assessment will be the primary thing that is looked at alongside the core actions and indicators of the IPG. So what kind of feedback will you get? You'll receive feedback on the how and the what. So depending upon which point in the lesson is seen, you'll get a piece of feedback on a component from the starter, engagement, or ending section, along with a piece of feedback on how far your task or lesson or an assignment progressed down the IPG in terms of how successfully those indicators were met. So let's look at an example scenario. Let's say a walkthrough happens at the beginning of your class. The focusing activity consists of 3 questions about a text that the class read yesterday, but then the lesson immediately jumps from the focusing activity to a time of direct instruction. In a case like this, a couple of pieces of feedback you might receive are: 1, on the how section, the person doing the walkthrough might emphasize the importance of taking a couple of minutes to communicate the lesson's objectives and a basic agenda for the class before moving from the focusing activity into the direct instruction portion of a lesson. Some hypothetical feedback on the what might be that the questions from the focusing activity could be answered without any evidence from the text, so core action 2, indicator B, would be identified as a place to strengthen. Lastly, this is an example of a blank feedback form that will be used during coaching conversations. These appear on the back of the instructional framework documents. As you can see, there are places for the person conducting the walkthrough to jot down questions while they're in your room, things they want to know more about, and then an area to identify feedback on the how and the what. This feedback is very important and is the main outcome of the coaching conversation because it gives you something tangible and concrete to use to improve your practice as we move forward.
Now we must begin the work of working our plan. By improving our what and our how, while emphasizing literacy in all areas, we will meet our goals. It is imperative that as a district we have laser-like focus on these 3 areas: what we teach, how we teach, and authentic literacy. We must pursue these and not compromise their simplicity, their clarity, and focus. In an overarching view, we must remember that everything we are doing is pointing toward career readiness for our students. We want our students to be able to walk across the stage having options and opportunities. We will do this with a continued focus on our school climate and culture, program alignment, early foundations, workforce development, and a fundamental literacy expectation for all students. We must trust the process. These are the keys to success. Thank you.